Dr. Jody Gangloff-Kaufmann. For those of you that don't know Jody, she is the Associate Director for Community and Urban IPM, and she specializes in the management of bedbugs, ticks, stinging insects, and ants. She's currently involved in efforts to improve IPM in schools and to increase tick safety awareness through live and online presentations. And Jody also recently developed a new guide for cooperative extension educators and volunteers on answering questions about bedbugs. So Jody's talk for today's presentation is ants in your plants and home. Here's why and how to avoid common perimeter ants. Thank you, Jody.
Thanks for being here. I'm going to try to make sure everybody can see. As Barb made very clear, we know that conditions on the outside of any building, whether it's a commercial building or a home, can affect what happens on the inside. And that, goes from water intrusion to all the way to pests, insects, and sometimes even plants will make their way indoors because they can get right under the siding. Why they do that, I don't know. So, this is the landscape outside my office. I have a lot to talk about sometimes. Okay, that said, let's talk about ants because I'm going to hype up the ants first, and then I'll talk about what we can do. But ant diversity is, it's big because the Hymenoptera are among the most highly evolved of the insects. Ants share that order with bees and wasps, as most you know. There are roughly 12,400 species of ants, but that probably is an underestimate because the tropics are filled with species we do not know about yet. Only about 21 species are household pests in North America, and there's a difference between what happens in the western part of the country and the east. So here in the east, we have, a handful of ants that are really going to become problems, and I'm just going to talk about three. I'm going to limit my talk to just three species that are most common. Ants are the number one pest, for people who have pests in their home. Ants are everyone. Who hasn't had ants in their house? Right? Okay. Okay, so, ants play a very significant role in ecological systems. One of the things they do is they aerate soil, and that happens throughout the landscape, especially in suburbia. But they also, participate in this soil cycling or this nutrient cycling. And right here, it's a blurry picture, but you can see this big, huge mound. This is an Allegheny mound ant mound. It's probably 2 feet or 2.5 feet wide and 1.5 feet tall. That is a lot of soil that those ants have brought to the surface, and they have these extensive colonies underneath the soil. But there's a really stark example of how that ant is helping to maintain, because they're native, helping to maintain this forest health. Okay, so decomposition and nutrient cycling, again, ants will visit carrion. They will hunt other insects, and they will eat things that are all, they'll visit carrion. I saved you a picture. I didn't show the gory parts, but that is a dead mouse, and it's covered with carpenter ants. And so they will feed on things like this. And in a way, they're kind of a sanitation crew, right? They are responsible for seed dispersal in healthy environments. So they'll move seeds away from wherever that parent plant was, and they bury the seeds in their, it ends up underground in their colonies. And, a lot of those seeds germinate. Beep. Pest control. You can see that ant right there. That's a carpenter ant carrying off a wireworm, which are problematic for growers of potatoes and things like that. Wireworms are native as well, but they do cause problems. And ants do a lot of pest control. They really prey on other insects as much as they can. They are interested in protein. Yep. And really importantly, ants are a source of food for other animals, and that includes especially the woodpeckers. So this is a pileated woodpecker, and a great portion of that animal's diet is carpenter ants, and that is why they look for trees that might have hollows in them and go ahead and dig into and find those carpenter ant colonies. So we know ants are critical for healthy ecosystems, and it really pains me when I see the pest product companies advocating for treating ants in the lawn. Ants are good in the lawn. They aerate the soil. So ants are definitely critical for healthy environments, but they do cause damage. ants can actually protect sap-feeding insects that are on your plants. And those sap-feeding insects might be the pest of that plant. They might just be, casual, but they may be, helping to weaken that plant. And so they will protect them because what do feeding insects, sap-feeding insects provide? Honeydew. And that's a sweet that ants feed on and rely on and love. Ants can also come indoors and contaminate food when they're foraging. They carry bacteria on their bodies. They can transfer bacteria. And there's a type of ant that can get into hospitals and actually contaminate the wounds of people or the mouths or whatever fluids. It's a really, I'm not going to talk about that ant, but they can cause human disease for that reason. That's a very specific example. But another thing they do is undermine hardscapes. So everyone has seen little piles of soil between the sidewalk pieces, and that is probably pavement ants excavating underneath that hardscape, bringing that sand up to the surface. And over time, they can, ooh, I got a new one. Over time, they can cause the undermining of that, and the tipping of pieces of landscape or hardscapes, patios, all kinds of things. Ants can do structural damage. In the case of carpenter ants, they're usually just furthering structural damage. They get in where there's already water damage or termite damage. They'll talk about that. And then occasional lawn damage. I think the harvester ants, which we don't have in the East, are really largely responsible for lawn damage because they like to clear an area around their colony entrance. But so, and let's talk about the aesthetic part. People don't like ants, and there's a real personal disgust with ants. There's a sensation called formication, which is where you feel like ants are crawling on you. It's formica, like that's it's ants, right? So formication, and those of us who deal with delusory parasitosis, we deal with that condition a lot. So there are just innate fears of ants and kind of disgust. Now I want to just point out the difference between ants and termites because I still get this question a lot. It's pretty easy to tell them apart. If you see a pile of wings, somewhere in a structure or even outside, but mostly in a structure, and they're all the same size, that indicates a termite problem. Termites and ants are about the same size, the ones that are household pests. Termites don't have a constricted waist the way ants do. Ants are more like wasps, right? They're more like wasps and bees, constricted waist. Termites have a straight waist. Termites have straight antennae. Ants have genicular, elbowed antennae. And the size of the wings on an ant is too large forewings, too small hind wings, just like bees. So, and this is a good picture because those are mature adult termites, but those are workers. They look like larvae, right? But those are mature adult termites that are working. They're the ones that will feed on wood and do all the work to maintain the termite colony. So the ones you see with wings are just the reproductives that are produced at a time when the colony is healthy and ready to reproduce. All right, so perimeter dwelling ants that invade structures. Come on, don't do it. Back. Yeah, all right. I'm just going to cover carpenter ants, the odorous house ant, which is America's #1 pest problem, and then pavement ants. And these right here are our docile little odorous house ants. They're kind of cute. We'll talk about, okay, carpenter ants first. Now, how many people have seen carpenter ants? Everyone, right? And have you seen carpenter ants that look different than other carpenter ants? Like they have more red in their bodies? Because we have various species of carpenter ants here in New York. We actually have a New York carpenter ant, Nova boracensis, Camponotus nova, anyway. So it's really easy to tell carpenter ants from other ants because for the most part, they are larger than most of the other ants that we have. If you see a large ant that is nearly an inch, like 3/4 of an inch, whether it has wings or not, you know that's a carpenter ant. They're the biggest ones. The rounded thorax, so right there where the legs come out, we have a rounded thorax. That's unique. All the other larger sized ants have a groove in their thorax, and carpenter ants have just a round, perfectly round hump. Yeah, carpenter ants have various sized workers, so you may see some large ones, you may see small ones as well. They have main colonies and satellite colonies. So the main colony tends to be in hollow trees. That is their favorite habitat. It's the right moisture level. And how do trees become hollow? It's usually because of water damage from injury or termite damage from below, or both. And so carpenter ants will actually drive out termites and will take over a space and set up colonies. But then those satellite colonies, so there's one queen in a carpenter ant colony. The satellite colonies, that's where you get your household pest from. They will move some older larvae and some workers into a space. It could be, I had them in my garage door, like the hollow of the garage door. I had them in my cabinet one day. They just decided to move into the cabinet because there was some chocolate in there. It was crazy. I didn't get a picture. That was crazy. But so these satellite colonies keep in touch with the main colony. They manage the older larvae and they feed the older larvae and they take care of them. So it's a really interesting system. There can be, I've heard up to 8, but typically about 4 satellite colonies. And this is significant if you have a tree that is, within a reasonable distance or definitely on your property close enough to the house, you can easily have a hidden carpenter ant colony in that tree, and then those satellite colonies popping up because they move in there. And how would you know if you have? Well, I'm going to get to that, but you might see trailing at night up and down that major tree. They excavate damaged wood. They don't eat wood. And you can see this piece of wood here. It's kind of like smooth galleries through the wood. There's no debris. There's no frass, which is insect poop, where termites make this kind of sandy frass. And termites do a little bit of webbing. So we're not seeing that in a carpenter ant colony. And as I said, they're more active at night with this trailing behavior up and down their main colony tree. They are predators and they are scavengers. You can see I put some honey out and attracted all of the ants because that is a bonanza for them. They will forage indoors, they will nest indoors, and they will feed on everything sweet: honeydew, honey, syrup, juice, and think trash and recycling and how that is positioned in your yard in relation to the house, because that could be, you wouldn't even know it, maybe feeding or attracting ants. Carpenter ants will feed on dead insects. They'll feed on live insects too, and carrion, as I showed you, but also dog and cat food. They're really fond of those kind of things. Dry, wet, it doesn't matter. They will come and forage for it. And in the bottom picture, it's hard to see, but those are 2 ants that seem to be fighting over a fly. I think that's your picture, Matt, right? Yeah. So they really, they're very active in the environment. Yep. Okay, so how would you know if you have carpenter ants? Well, if you see ants, if you see carpenter ants indoors, outdoors, walking away from your house, toward your house, if you see carpenter ants, you might want to take a look at where they might be nesting because they could be causing damage indoors. Yep. You might see piles of wood shavings combined with dead ants. Again, carpenter ants, all ants, no ants eat wood. They excavate it. So it does look like pieces of sawdust, and the little ant body parts in there are just, dead ants that got the boot. And then there's a sound. There's a sound associated with carpenter ants. If you're quiet in your home or wherever you are, and you hear what sounds like Rice Krispies, snap, crackle, pop, that could be carpenter ants doing some excavation in your house, creating a space for that colony, that little nest. And yeah, there are lots of recordings of this, and I think I heard it in my bathroom this night. Oh, yeah, I've got to check. So, a lot of all these pictures that I'm going to tell you what not to do, these are like my house. So a lot of experience here. And then odorous house ant, right? Why is it called an odorous house ant? Well, some of you all know, right? It smells like blue cheese. If you crush one, if you can get one, you crush it with your finger, which is cruel, and you smell it. If you smell something really pungent, and people have related that to the smell of blue cheese, although I don't know what the smell of blue cheese is, then it's absolutely going to be odorous house ant. They're really the only one that smells really pungent. They're 2 to 3 millimeters in size, which is small. They can be light or dark brown, lightish, medium, dark. And they're all one size. As you can see here, they kind of line up around a food source like this. And they have extensive multi-queen colonies, and they have many little nests. They're polydomous. But what is fascinating about this insect is that odorous house ant, or Tapinoma sessile, is a forest-dwelling insect. They make little colonies in the forest in undisturbed places, and those colonies have a single queen and a few, 100 workers. They're very polite around other ants. They don't fight with other ants. They're like one of the nicest ants out there. But when they are turned loose in a disturbed environment, you go in and you build a house, or we build a road and we have stores, this ant has and I don't think anyone really understands how it works, but it has a switch. It switches to an invasive species style or lifestyle. And so what you get is extensive multi-queen colonies, and they can run several properties. You might have in a suburban area, everybody's dealing with these ants because it's all one colony. And so these ants are called tramp ants because those little colonies, they might have their own queen. They pick up and move about every 30 days. And so if they get disturbed, they'll move. If the food source changes, they'll move the whole colony closer to the food source. And so they're hard to control. They're hard to control. They're hard to keep out of a house if they're hungry. And environmental conditions may cause them to come indoors if it's too dry, if it's too wet, and a few other things I'll talk about. But they really love honeydew and sweets. So these are the ones that are going to be tending, the sap-feeding insects on your plants. They will forage for protein. We had them coming in for cat food, in the center of our house, so we know we have problems. And they'll come looking for water as well. And I said they'll move the small colonies to areas with food. So they are tramp ants because they get up and leave. Where do they nest? Now, this is a video. Could you? Okay, so where do they nest? They nest anywhere. Under mulch, under landscape cloth. Hey, that's another reason maybe not to use that around the perimeter. They will be under wood and stones in the perimeter landscape. You can see here, they were in my sprinkler. And I turned the sprinkler on, tried to knock them out, turned it on, and it was completely clogged because there were plenty of ants still inside of it. So we've had pest control call up and say, I don't know where these ants are. And later on, I heard they were in the sprinkler control box. They just couldn't find it. And that was close enough to the house to be causing problems indoors. They'll be inside mailboxes too. People have taken videos and shown that odorous house ant will invade a mailbox as long as there's food nearby and whatever they can find. So any little space can be an odorous house ant nest. Okay, on to pavement ants. These are a little bit bigger. They're about twice the size of odorous house ants. They're a dark brown, but what's really pretty about them, if you look closely, is that they have this sculptured exoskeleton with grooves. They have a 2-node petiole, which I didn't really talk about nodes because it's too much, but to me they look square. They're long. The middle section, the thorax, and those nodes is narrower than the head and the abdomen, which are about the same width. And you can see here, this is another video. The colonies are obviously built under hardscapes and stones and slab foundations. They create those crater-shaped piles of sand, and they are territorial. So a colony like this in the mid-spring to early summer is going to flush out and try to move and expand the colony. And so they don't have super colonies. They fight each other for that space. And it'll be a field of dead ants, but somehow they clean them all up. And you may not see any of this. But they're territorial. And that's why you see these flushes of ants. There are a lot of beautiful, not beautiful, but good pictures of them. So pavement ants will eat almost anything. This is another video. My 3 videos here. Thank you, Matt. They'll eat almost anything from honeydew to carcasses to human food. They really like oils. So a Triscuit has a lot of oil in it and some carbs, a lot of carbs. And they'll enter homes foraging for food, especially sweets and fats. And yeah. they'll, if you see if you see a drop of ice cream on a sidewalk on a summer day, you're going to see pavement ants all around that to feed on that. Okay, yep. So I'm going to talk about minimizing ants in the perimeter landscape. To get to what Barb was saying, these plants are nice and tiny. I can't tell, they might be boxwoods, right? Can you tell? Huh? Oh, those are used, okay. And so they're small now. They look very tidy and neat, and the mulch goes right up to the foundation. So this is not an ant-free landscape. It could become overgrown, and it could become a haven for ants, especially if there's landscape cloth underneath there. But when you're talking about minimizing ants in the landscape, you're thinking about what they're eating, what are you supplying that they're eating, whether you're supplying nesting sites, creating nesting sites for them, whether you have excessive moisture that favors them in the landscape, like maybe your irrigation there's just too much hitting the house or hitting the building. And then there's access indoors, which, for the years that Matt and I have been working together, we've been focused on pest exclusion. And I don't like to talk about pest exclusion so much with ants because ants are like water. They'll get in through the tiniest cracks. But there are things we can do to minimize their access to our buildings and homes. All right. Oh, naturally, of course. So in the landscape, there are naturally occurring sugars. We know that, flowering plants will provide nectar. Some of them have extra floral nectaries on the outside of the plant or away from the flower. So we all understand the relationship between peonies and ants, right? It's famous. Like my grandmother was convinced that the ants are necessary for the peony to bloom, which is not really true. But what the ants do, the ant-peony relationship, is that the peony supplies sugar, nectar, via extrafloral nectaries, inviting ants to visit, inviting ants to roam and eliminate any competition or eliminate any leaf feeding or petal feeding insects on that plant. So, this is a sort of mutualistic relationship that results in a healthier plant, and the ants are very happy about this. You might have tree sap from wounds or stress. Maple syrup, maple sap is going to be a delicious meal for ants. That's another thing to keep in mind if you have an ant problem. Look out for tree sap falling. You might have fruits. These are the ones I could think of that might be in the perimeter landscape: a serviceberry, a crabapple, a yew. I know that yews have poisonous seeds, but the berry around it, which is actually pine cone, as I understand, is, it's full of carbohydrates, so it is edible for them. So, if you have these plants and they're persistent ant problems, you might ask yourself, should I move those peonies away from the foundation, put them in a different place in the yard, and put something that's not as attractive to ants in that landscape? That might be one thing you do. Do you have landscape plants with honeydew producers? Do you have little pest organisms on your landscape plants that are feeding the ants, encouraging the ants to nest close by? Because when you have aphid, all these different things, even plant hoppers and stink bugs, once they either go away, maybe there's a rainstorm or a cold snap, or you've used a pesticide to protect your plant, once those sap feeders go away, if they do, those ants are like, oh, well, where'd the food go? They will start foraging indoors if they're close enough to the structure. So it's good to keep that in mind. We like to leave a few insects like this out there for the predators and such. But if if they die, or if it's cold, or you may cause a flush into your house or building. But let's talk about spotted lanternfly in the environment. So spotted lanternflies are not everywhere in New York State yet, but eventually we think they will be. And in places where they are highly numerous, Queens being one of the places, what you get is like almost a rain of honeydew coming down, and it coats everything. And it definitely enhances the foraging of not just ants, but bees and yellow jackets and other insects that will collect that sweet honeydew. And I believe that this can really enhance the population of things like ants and yellow jackets in an area. And I have an anecdote. Yeah. So the anecdote is, and I just realized it this week. So where I live, we had a nice, healthy population of spotted lanternfly really for the first time last year. And what I've noticed this year is nothing but queen yellow jackets everywhere. It's going to be a bad yellow jacket year, and I'm really suspicious that it's because there was extra honeydew around, and the yellow jackets did very well last season. Keep in mind, if you're in like anywhere with a spotted lanternfly, you may see a lot of yellow jackets this year. Now, there's another really cool story to tell about ants in the landscape, and that is the relationship of citronella ants to root aphids. So you can see, this is a rock that I lifted up, and what I see here is ants tending what look like little sheep. They're tiny root aphids. This was around a dogwood tree, and they were very much protecting it. They're protecting them so much that they have these in corrals. They have built corrals to keep their little sheep in, right? And so these root aphids are parthenogenic. The females are females, and females give rise to new babies, right? And sometimes they get to be a bit much. But with the ants tending these guys to harvest the honeydew, as these root aphids feed on roots, they're also creating babies. And the ants decide, for whatever, at whatever point, that the babies are good protein. And so it's like having livestock. It's literally, so they're milking them and they're harvesting them for protein. It's the oddest and coolest relationship I've seen in my yard, but in the ant world. And so I don't even know what the species of aphid is. I've been trying to figure that out for a while now. So that's that. Okay. So there are other ant attractors out there. Pet food left outside. It could be trash and recycling, which I mentioned before, but you may not even realize that the trash and recycling is supporting or attracting ants to your area. Dead insects, dead animals, and then residues on the barbecue grill. I thought of this like, yeah, there's a lot of grease in a barbecue grill, underneath, inside, whatever, totally accessible to any ants around. And you have to wonder how much sanitation they are actually doing. If they're feeding on that oil, are they helping because they're cleaning? I don't know. I just, that might be a thing. And we just might be overlooking it, right? Are we creating harborage and nesting sites around the foundation of a building? Ants will nest under stones, under wood, under and inside potted plants, mulch, and landscape cloth. They will also nest in old stumps underground. So if you've had a shrub that's too close to the foundation, whatever, you've cut it to ground level, the root that's still there not only will attract termites, but it could become a harborage for ants. And nearby trees with hollows, as I mentioned before, how would we know? We want to see those trailing ants. But the irrigation control and electric boxes and toys, planters, sprinklers, all these things, the little bits of infrastructure that have little spaces in them, when they're too close to the house, they may be the source or the home of some odorous house ants, for example. And it's good to keep in mind, if you're having a problem indoors with ants, to look at these pieces of infrastructure in your yard and your perimeter. Here we have an enclosed space. Looks like the roof has been taken off, and that would be the, right, that's like the ceiling beneath. And so thank you, Matt, this is Matt's picture. But that is a healthy little carpenter ant colony, so they don't always need soil tunnels and galleries or wooden tunnels and galleries. They're just happy inside this box, which is part of the roof. And you may not know that, but this is where, if you are close enough to it, you might hear that the snap, crackle, pop. And also we have a pile of wood next to a deck very close to the foundation. This is problematic for a lot of reasons, because you could have mice in this pile of wood, but you can easily harbor ants. And the longer it sits there, the more likely you'll have a healthy carpenter ant colony in that space. So damage or decaying structures. You can see carpenter ants just looking up on a structure and carpenter ants making it into the eave of this house. And so that would be visible on that brick up and down. They'd be trailing up and down on that brick. The crack in the foundation, that could be somewhere close to the ground, and where ants are nesting, they could be getting right inside through that crack. And so the solution there, I mean, the solution in the first one is to renovate. The second one, you want to fill that crack for a lot of reasons. That is moisture intrusion, termites can make their tubes there, and ants and stuff. But that could also require some engineering inspections, right? And then you might just have wooden infrastructure outside, just structures, your porch, your pergola, whatever. And you know, eventually termites might get to it, but then carpenter ants will get to it. So anything like that. And water or moisture on the outside of, or the perimeter. Ants, like all animals, need water. They often forage for water. If you remember last year, at least southeastern New York, we went through August to November or something with no rain. And that caused a lot of stuff in my yard to die. But it also, you know, can stress out insects like ants and others, bees, and force them to be foraging indoors because you have some, you know, condensation on some of the pipes. That could be what's happening. And in that case, you might want to be supplying water on the outside to keep the ants from coming in. Landscape conditions that are excessively wet or excessively dry will drive ants indoors looking for better, you know, conditions. Some plants like this plant here, a cup plant, will collect water. And so that could be helping out insects like ants if it's close to the foundation. I don't know if anyone would put this close to their foundation. It's pretty big. But yeah, that is a little pool of water inviting ants and other insects to come and you know, hang out. And then drought, which I kind of just mentioned. So water, although I think it's more of a minor issue, can result in, and when water hits the side, if you have irrigation that's hitting the siding or getting underneath the siding or anything, you can create conditions that carpenter ants love. So we have to think about how much water we're getting underneath and up into the siding and the roof area. You know, I didn't even think of it, but the condition of gutters can play a huge role in how carpenter ants get into a home. So if you have gutters that are in poor repair, they're standing water, they've collected leaves and they haven't been cleaned out in a while, not only can they cause rot of that eave, the edge of the roof, they can cause, carpenter ants can move in, and that is a favorite place, especially when there are trees above and even touching that roof. You're creating perfect conditions for carpenter ants. So cleaning gutters, having them in good repair is really important. Not just carpenter ants, you know, for mosquitoes too. But access to indoors, this is kind of what I'm leading to, can include any plant that's touching the building. Here, you know, it's just a couple of raspberries or something, but a lot of people ignore the Virginia creeper that's coming up on their chimney or something. And the trees that are, or the shrubs in the landscape that are touching just the side of the house or the window or something, all of that can just be a bridge, either for foraging or for, you know, that nesting, which they might set up a nest inside a void there. Mulch against the foundations, not always a problem, but if you have ants, that might be something to look at, because you know, mostly odorous house ants, maybe pavement ants if you have stones there too, but mostly odorous house ants will be underneath that mulch if it's nice and protected and, you know, in a good spot near food. And then there are gaps around doors and windows, which is hard to see really, it's hard to know. But if they're coming, if you have ants coming in a door or a window, which you might see the trailing, that is a good place to add some caulk. It may not work fully, but at least you can try to keep them out of your living space. Now there are indoor attractants as well. Of course, the food, the drinks, the pet food that we have indoors, the heating unit, you know, on the sunny side of the structure might be very attractive to ants in the colder temperatures in the winter and stuff. But houseplants with honeydew on them, like if you have houseplants that have scale insect like this one, you may be creating on some windowsill nowhere near the kitchen conditions that attract ants. And what are they doing? They're just cleaning, really.
That's not going to stop because you still have scale insect on that plant, and they're creating honeydew that is attracting ants. So keep that. The fundamentals of ant management. We want to stop feeding the ants. We want to move objects away from the foundation and create nesting areas. We don't want the perimeter to be excessively wet, or really excessively dry. And then we want to reduce access to the indoors. Here is a picture of Jerome doing some talking around a doorway, which is a great idea if you have, you know, some seen ants there, just closing up that gap and stop them.
So gaps around doors and windows, that's just recommended anyway for other insects and other problems. Okay, so we've done that, we've done that. Come on. So the question is, how do we kill ants? Yeah, we can do all these nice things to keep them out, to not feed them, but they may still come. So how do we kill ants? The suspense is killing me. You know, and so there are products on the market for a homeowner to use at home, not in a commercial way. If you're licensed, you would use it, you know, you obviously as a commercial pesticide applicator, but there are products that people can use in their own homes, including a desiccant like silica gel dust or a toxicant like boric acid. We know boric acid isn't a desiccant. It is a stomach toxicant for ants because they groom their bodies, they pick it up as they walk, they groom their bodies, and it's a slow-acting toxicant. But boric acid is one of the fundamental, you know, old school things to use for ants. And you would never want piles of boric acid around. You would only want a fine dust in an area away from people and pets. And toxicants like pyrethroid dusts, usually they are in the silica gel dust. And I'm not sure that's actually available to the public. I don't know if we know. But there are various dusts that can be used. I'm not going to advocate that. There are liquid sprays, right? Various pesticide ingredients. People say, what can I use to kill them? As long as it's on the label, as long as the location is on the label, you know, that's fair game. But it may not be the best strategy, especially for something like ants. And then we have baits. We have granular baits. There are pastes with protein and fats. And then there are sweet gel baits. There are those little hockey pucks that you see in the supermarket. Those are not very palatable to ants, so I don't really recommend those things over a sweet gel bait, for example. Come on. Did I? Yeah. Never use total release foggers, please. They are not prescribed for ants. They're not good for anything. I don't know. People try to use these for a lot of household pests, and it just puts pesticide everywhere where you do not want it. So that said, move on. So baits are really a great approach for ants. They are like a targeted application for ants, as long as it's not in an area where other, like bees can get to it or other Hymenoptera. And if they're targeted, placed in the way of an ant path or something like that, you really are precision, you know, targeting. Sprays, if you use a spray to kill ants, you're only going to kill a certain amount of foragers. You're only going to kill who's out of the colony, which is very few compared to the size of the colony, and you're not going to affect the colony at all. Slow-acting baits are the best option here because it allows foragers to collect, to store it in their gut, and to bring back to the colony. And the goal is to kill the larvae. The larvae are the heart of the colony. So we want to bring toxicant back inside, possibly kill the queen, and that's the end goal, is really to get to the colony itself. Not the workers, they're not the problem. It's the whole colony. So what type of bait should you use? Should I go with a gel? Should I go with a protein? Here's our test. That is a card with honey and peanut butter, right? Put it out. Next, there's your answer, right? So we have ants. This is what they like. So go with a sweet gel. That is an easy test to do. baiting ants, or if you're going to bait indoors or outdoors, both are legitimate. And if you were to bait indoors, you would pretty much want to use a bait tray. You want to keep it inaccessible to people and pets, kids and pets, in a little bait tray, out of the way, where ants are trailing or something. And if you're doing it outside, you can use this stake, ant bait container to protect the bait. You don't want to have bait drying out. You don't want the rain to get it. And you also don't want to use dust or liquid insecticides anywhere near the bait. So if you're going to bait and you're going to use a slow acting bait, especially indoors, expect an ant party. You're going to have a party, but eventually it will work. Okay, so a combination of management strategies, including the removal of food, harborage, reducing access to the indoors by cutting plants back and things like that, and careful baiting can really eliminate most ant problems, but there may be a there may be a time to call a pest professional. 2 instances here: when you have persistent, ongoing problems that have not been solvable because perhaps you have one of those giant super colonies of odorous house ants that you share with your neighbor, and then you may want to call somebody in to help. And if you have carpenter ants that are causing damage in a roof, in a void, a porch or something, you probably want professional help with that. That's a structural issue, and you're going to want to do some renovation to fix the damage. But again, carpenter ants don't start the damage, they just continue the damage. So that's it.